So today is Mother's Day, and it's a great day that we get to celebrate in the life of our church and in the lives of our families, and so that's good because it's days like this that we remember that we together are a larger family that God is building and He's invited us into. And so what we celebrate today on Mother's Day is really, like I was saying before, greater than biological or even adoptive motherhood. It's really all about influence. That's really, I think, what this day is designed to capture. And specifically for us, it's the godly influence that so many different women have had in our lives. People who've loved us, nurtured us, who've prayed over us, who've taught us, who've had a part in shaping our lives. And so while I'm personally blessed to have two mothers now, I've got my mom and I've got my mother-in-law. And if you're watching the video, hi, I love you. Just give me a shout out, right? Hopefully earning some brownie points, because I don't know about you, but in my family, sometimes brownie points translate into actual brownies, and that's always welcomed, right? But beyond them, there are so many other women who my entire life have invested their time in life, in me, and helping me draw closer to Jesus. Anyone else have that? I see heads nodding. Yeah, okay. So this is one of the great things about following Jesus. He saves us out of a life where we feel like we're kind of doing everything on our own, and He saves us into this new family that we call the church. It's His family, and this is just our corner of it here gathered together. So it's good for us to celebrate this. And again, if you are 18 years of age or over and you're a female, we just celebrate the influence that you have on us. We've got that gift for you, and make sure you pick it up today before you leave the worship service, because again, we're thankful for the influence you have in connecting people to Jesus. That's what we're honoring. Now, since we're talking about family, if there's one thing I think every family could use just a little bit more of, it's this thing that we're looking at today called grace. Every family could use a little more grace. Now, we've looked at this before, but let me just kind of see if we could define this word and get us all on the same page. And to do that, let's begin with what grace is not, okay? And so grace is different from, another word, justice, okay? Justice is about getting what we deserve, okay? So you study hard and you get the A. You break the law and you get the fine, right? That's justice. We kind of get that. Justice is all about getting what we deserve, but justice is different from grace. Grace is also different from another word that we often kind of lump in with it. It's called mercy, okay? Because mercy is about not getting what you deserve, okay? That's what mercy is. So you break the law, and instead of the fine, you get off with a warning. We all love it when we get mercy, don't we? I know I do, especially when you just get that verbal warning, not even a written one. Oh, that's nice, especially for pastors, right? We shouldn't be getting those at all, but I got a lead foot, so there you go. You forget an assignment. You fail to get the project done. Instead of getting the 0, instead of getting fired, maybe you get the extension. Okay, that's mercy. It's not getting what you deserve. Grace moves beyond both justice and mercy, because grace is about getting what you could never deserve. Getting what you could never deserve. So let's just kind of make this our working definition for now. Grace is about getting what we could never deserve. Now, we get justice. We understand mercy, right? But it's this area of grace where we tend to wrestle. And let me just see if I can show you what I mean, okay? There are some days that we love grace. We love it. That day was just a couple of weeks ago for a man named Scott Schmidt. He won Publishers Clearinghouse. He lives at West Middleton, Indiana, just outside of Kokomo, and just a couple of weeks ago got $20,000. Right? Now, none of us deserves to win anything like that. We haven't done anything to earn the fact that they're going to give us thousands of dollars, or maybe the big prize, a couple of $1 million. But none of us are going to object when that prize van rolls up and they whip out the big check and the balloons and the streamers and all of that. We're all going to receive that. We love that, right? This brings joy to our lives when Publishers Clearinghouse comes and graces you with their presence. So there are some times that we love to get what we could never deserve. But there are other times when we really resist the idea of grace. Again, here's another recent example. There was a CNN town hall debate. Maybe you caught it on the news a couple of weeks ago. Bernie Sanders was asked if, in particular, terrorists and sexual offenders who are serving time currently in prison should receive the right to vote. He responded, and I'm quoting his response here. He said, yes, even terrible people have the right to vote. That response absolutely lit up the media, and especially social media, as people responded to his comments almost entirely in shock and anger. Right? Now, what was he doing? Bernie Sanders wanted to give and extend voting rights to people who were serving for breaking the law, really violating the rights of other people. Things that most Americans, according to the reaction, say they absolutely don't deserve those types of rights. Okay? Including the right to vote. So while there are times that we love grace, brings joy to our lives, there are other moments where we're like, no, grace is a bad idea, and we resist it with everything in us. I want to be clear today, I'm not endorsing or slamming Bernie Sanders. I know that talking about politics always gets people a little edgy. Whether you like him or not as a candidate is not the point. I just think that these two pictures help illustrate where we struggle when it comes to this thing called grace. Getting what we could never deserve. Sometimes we love it, sometimes we hate it. And all of that, I think, is rooted in the truth that grace is really a foreign deal to us. I mean, it just upsets and turns everything in life on end. And honestly, the grace that we often encounter in this world, like these two pictures, it's what I would call cheap grace, not real grace. Because this is grace without sacrifice. This is grace without transformation. And so that, I think, makes it even harder in our struggle to know what grace is. But really knowing what this thing called grace is about is essential, because our entire life with Jesus is wrapped up in this thing. And it's something I think we have to recapture and really hold to, not just in our heads as we try to understand this. Okay, no, we have to receive it deeply into our hearts so that we live in it, and more than that, we live out of it, so that we receive it, we could say, but we also extend it. Okay? Now hang with me. There's a moment, and there's an encounter between Jesus and the disciple Peter, shown to us in John chapter 21. That's really where we're going to be journeying today. That helps us to see what real, true grace looks like up close. Because I think the best way for us to see grace is to see God in action, because this is how he moves. Okay? This is how he moves towards us. So I just want to take a moment today, look at how God moves, place him, if we can, under the microscope, and how he moves, and put grace under the microscope today. And so this is what we read beginning in verse 2. So Simon Peter and Thomas, who's also known as the twin, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, we know them better as James and John, and two other disciples were together. I'm going fishing, Peter told them. And they said, well, then we'll go with you. And just pause there. Now, to really set this up, and I think to really get into the head space, if I can use that word, of Peter, we have to move just back a little bit from this moment in his life, right? Peter is one of the first disciples that Jesus called. He's been following Jesus now for a little over 3 years. And not just casually following him. I mean, Peter is all in. We see Peter in some of these amazing faith moments in the life of Jesus. Like the time Jesus came walking on the water to the disciples. Everybody else is like freaking out, wigging out. Peter was part of that, but he's the only one who called out to him and said, Lord, if that's really you, call to me to come on the water to you. Right? And then he does the incredible as Jesus says, come. He climbs out of the boat and starts walking on the water. Incredible faith moment. Peter's also the first one to declare to Jesus who he is. Jesus pulls the disciples together and he says, "Who do people say that I am?" And they start answering about the gossip that they're picking up. Then he says, "Okay, but what about you?" And it's like crickets, right? They can hear crickets chirping. Nobody's answering. No one's saying a thing. And then Peter responds. He says, "You are the Christ. You're the promised Savior. You're the Son of the living God." It's this amazing faith declaration, right? It's Peter. He's always boisterous. He's always striving to be the first person to answer Jesus. He wants to please Jesus. He's jumping in with both feet to follow Jesus. I mean, he's committed to him every step of the way. But then came Good Friday. Jesus was arrested. He was led away to face this mockery of a trial. And while most of Jesus' disciples fled when things got tense, Peter hung in there. He followed Jesus at a distance, about as far as he could, to the courtyard just outside where this trial was being held. Okay, and then it happened. You know the story. Peter denied knowing Jesus, not just one time, but 3 times. And what's worse is that the Bible tells us that on that third denial, they brought Jesus out as Peter was speaking, and he saw Jesus staring at him across the courtyard. Pete thought he could stand the heat. He promised Jesus, "I'll go all the way with you, even if that means dying with you, no matter what." But when the pressure came, he folded like a cheap napkin. I mean, he crumbled on the spot, and he rejected and he denied ever knowing Jesus, right when Jesus needed him the most. And so how do you come back from that, right? How do you do that? Easter Sunday came. We see Peter, he runs to the empty tomb. We see Peter later that night in the upper room. And while the disciples were filled with joy and wonder when they see Jesus risen from the dead, Peter, he's strangely silent. I mean, this is one of those moments you'd expect him to say something great or something. But he's just not his boisterous self. We know that he's there again a week later when Jesus appears to reach Thomas. We looked at that last week. We know that Peter's in the room because we're told that he is. But again, we don't hear a peep from him. He's just hanging back. Now that brings us to this moment. A few days later. And I think it's safe to say that Peter's just not in a good headspace. I mean, he's torn up over this triple denial of Jesus. And how can you possibly stay a disciple of Jesus when you fail so massively, right? And so he did the only thing he knew to do. He went fishing. Now, Kip, there's nothing wrong with going fishing. Just want to throw that out there. But Pete went back to Pete, BC, before Christ. He went back to the one thing he thought he couldn't mess up. And so as he climbed into the boat, you have to see that he's really climbing back into his old life. Tracking? Okay, so that's the moment. That's Peter's headspace. And I think most, if not all of us, as we look at him, we get it. We can relate. We've been in those moments where we've messed up and we know it. We've crossed the line. We're not sure that there's a way back. Right? And I think that some of us in this room even know what it means to go back to old patterns of dealing and old ways of living. I think we get what Peter is feeling and what he's going through in this moment. And it's easy for us to find ourselves in him. And I get that that's kind of not maybe the uplifting thought you wanted to hear today. But hang with me. Because it's what Jesus does with Peter that really speaks to you and me as well. Because we've been in his spot. Maybe you're there today. So let's get into this. Let's open this up and see what Jesus does. Peter's out on the lake. If you grew up, then you know what he's doing, right? He fished all night and caught no fishes. Out on the deep blue sea. Anybody else with me on that song? Sunday school? Yeah, some of you, right? Dawn breaks. With it, it brings exhaustion and frustration and disappointment because Peter has nothing to show for working all night long. But dawn also brings something else. Here's verse 4. At dawn, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. Right? They're out at a distance. Even after Peter had denied Jesus, even after he had returned to his old ways of dealing and moving, Jesus still moved to reach out to him. Because that's what real grace does. And in this moment, Jesus shows us this first truth, that he opens the way of grace in our lives by reaching out to us when we don't deserve it. When we don't deserve it. When we're not reaching for him. Jesus always takes the first step. And he shares this with us time and time again. In fact, one of the best places you could see Jesus is reaching and God's reaching for us is in these three stories Jesus shares with us in Luke chapter 15. Now, we looked at one of them last week. Jesus uses the image of a shepherd, right? He says, God is like a shepherd. I'm like a shepherd, he says. And a shepherd who sees that one of his sheep is lost. And then he says, but I'll just leave it out there. I come searching. I come reaching until I find my sheep. The sheep is you and me, right? We looked at that. And when he finds us, he carries us on his shoulders back to safety and then celebrates our return back home. He goes on, he says, God is like a woman who had 10 silver coins. Now, when you hear silver coins, think paychecks. So 10 paychecks, and one of them comes up missing. You and I, in this story, are that missing paycheck. And so this woman begins sweeping through her house, and she's tearing everything apart, trying to find that missing paycheck. And so can you picture that, right? God goes through all lengths to find you and me. He reaches into every crack and every crevice where we could hide. Not to hurt you, but to bring you back. Nothing is unturned. No place is unsearched because you are that valuable to him. He gives us one more image, though, in this kind of triple pack of stories. He says, God is like a father whose son rejected him and left him. Son crossed the line big time. But God the Father searched the horizon, waiting every day for the son to reappear. Just a glimpse of his boy, hoping every day. And when he finally caught sight of him, the father ran to him and he reached out with his arms. He brought him into this big bear hug, welcoming his son back home, right? And in telling us this, here's Jesus' point. No matter what you've done, no matter how far you've strayed in life, no matter how you cross the line or how far beyond the line you think you've gone, you belong to a God who is reaching for you. And I get that we don't deserve it. That's why it's called grace. Well, that's great to see. There's actually more that Jesus shows us. Here's what he opens up as we get back into this moment with Peter in verse 5. So Jesus comes, he's reaching out, he calls out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. And he said, "Throw your nets on the right side of the boat, and you'll be able to find some." And when they did, they were unable to haul in the net because of the large number of fish. And then the disciple whom Jesus loved, we know his name is John, he's the author, right? He says to Peter, "Pete, it's the Lord." Okay. So just from this moment, we get that this is a miraculous move as Jesus as Jesus tells them, cast your net on the other side, and Peter and the disciples, they go from no fish to overloaded with fish, right? It's the miraculous. But Jesus is doing so much more than just moving fish here, okay? He's recreating a moment. Some of you already know this, but it's not just any moment he's recreating. He's recreating the first moment he met Peter. Now, that took place about 3 years before. Peter had come in from a long night of fishing all night and caught no fishes, right? That's his life story, I think. But Jesus met him on the shore after a long, tiring night. And he said, Peter, can I borrow your boat? Right? He was preaching to people. There was no room for him to actually kind of stand. The crowd was getting to him. So he climbed into the boat, pushed out just a few feet so he could have just a little bit of space and keep preaching and teaching to the people. After the sermon, after Jesus dismissed the crowd, he said to Peter, hey, why don't we just push out into the lake for a little bit? Once they were away from shore, he says, Pete, why don't you drop your nets? When Peter did, instantly, there's this massive mess of fish that was caught. It was so big that he has to call to James and John, who are on the shore, to come out and help him haul in this mess of fish. It's miraculous. And it's because of this moment that Peter puts his faith in Jesus. Okay? So now Jesus is recreating this moment in Peter's life. The all-night struggle, the call to drop the nets, cast your nets, the beyond full catch of fish with a net that doesn't break. He does it all to recapture this first moment, the moment that Peter met him, all to reveal himself to Peter in this moment now. And that's, again, where we see another truth of what Jesus shows us. He opens up the way of grace by revealing himself when we're not really looking for him. But he moves. Man, I got to tell you, this is one of the greatest things I love about our God. He is always seeking us out in his grace to reveal himself to us. And this is really the work of God, the Holy Spirit, in the world today, as he goes out to every person on the face of the planet, and he just calls out and he says, I want you, and I want you, and I want you, and I want you. Because I made you, he said, for a greater purpose, a greater life than what you're living now. I made you to be loved by me, to live in that love. I designed you to move with me, to do and to be a part of all of these wonderful things that build people up, to help point them to the freedom and hope and life and love that's found only in Jesus. And so God, the Holy Spirit, right, he's constantly calling us up. He's always moving to help us lift our eyes to Jesus. He's constantly sending people into our lives, friends and family members and pastors and Sunday school teachers and small group leaders. At other times, though, he'll move like he did with Peter, and he will bring you back full circle to the moment when you first saw him. He will do whatever it takes to get your attention because he just wants to show how crazy he is about you. His great love for you. You hear me? The hope and freedom and healing found only in him because he is a God of grace, and that grace drives him to reveal himself to you and to me. And maybe you just need to see him today. I don't know what you're going through, but I think we could probably just stop right there for some people in this room. You just need another glimpse of God. And maybe that's your prayer. God, would you just reveal yourself to me today? I just need to see. I just need to be sure of you. And I believe that even in this moment right now, that God is breaking through. He's the God that wants to reveal himself. Aren't you thankful for that? Yeah, me too. So Peter's on the boat. Jesus is on shore. calls out to Peter and the other disciples, cast your nets on the other side. Miraculous catch of fish, just like the first time Peter met Jesus. The lights go on for John, and he says to Peter, it's the Lord. Instantly, Peter responds. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it's the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, his robe, for he'd taken it off, and he jumped into the water. Now the other disciples followed in the boat, and they're towing in the net full of fish, for they were not far from the shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. So can you picture this moment in your mind? Peter realizes that it's Jesus on the shore. He wants to respond, but he's stripped down to his shorts to work, right? It's just easier. Jesus is on shore. He wants to go to him. To get there faster than the boat means he's going to swim, right? And so he goes to the edge of the boat. He gets ready to jump in, and then he just pauses for a moment. Because this is Jesus we're talking about now. Not just the great teacher, not just his buddy, but man, this is the Son of God. This is the one who just conquered sin and death and the grave. And so Peter pauses because he's like, maybe me and my shorts is not the way I need to meet Jesus now. Maybe that's not proper enough. So he grabs his robe. He throws his robe around him, and now he jumps into the water fully clothed. Are you getting this? He's trying to dress up. He's trying to clean himself up for Jesus. And now he's swimming to shore. He climbs out on the shore, and he is drenched. I mean, water's pouring from his robe, from his hair. He's covered in a mixture of mud and sand. He tried to clean himself up for Jesus, but now he's an absolute mess. And yet Jesus receives him. Mess and all. He invites him. He says, hey, Pete, you look a little wet. I got a fire going. Why don't you come and sit down and dry off? Pete, are you hungry? I got fish for breakfast. You want some? Jesus, again, I think, just shows us this amazing truth about real, true grace. He's opened a way for us to step into a life of grace by receiving us when we're a mess. Again, I love this because how often do we find ourselves right here? I'll come to Jesus, but first, let me just kind of kick this addiction out of my life. First, let me get my anger under control. I'll come to him, but first, let me clean up and make right this issue, this area in my life that I know is not pleasing to him. I need to get this right. I know I need to follow him, but first, let me make sure that I'm in a good spot and my family is in a good spot, and then I can respond to Jesus. And we wrestle with knowing how to respond to him, don't we? I mean, we want to come to him, but we want to come when we're at our best, not at our worst. We want to come to him at our strongest moment, not in our mess. And so we wrap our robe around us so that we're not so exposed before Jesus. And why is that? Fear. Especially the fear of rejection. Maybe you've had these thoughts. What if Jesus doesn't like what he sees? What if I've crossed the line too far? What if my mess is too big for him? And the lies of the enemy, I got to tell you, they are ruthless when it comes to this, right? So Can I just speak the truth for you today? God showed his great love by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. When we were in over our heads in our mess. When we were dripping wet, covered in mud and sand and sin and shame. When we were absolutely nowhere near good enough. That's when Jesus died to rescue us. And today, he stands with arms wide open to receive us in our mess. Because that's what real, true grace does. Okay, but it doesn't just reach and it doesn't just reveal and it doesn't just receive. God's real, true grace also transforms as he restores us with his love. Okay? Now it's this campfire moment where we see this. There's this encounter between Jesus and Peter, and this is what we pick up beginning in verse 15. We can get that. There we go. When they'd finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? More than your old life? More than the comfort of what's familiar? More than fishing, your old way of dealing? Do you love me more than that?" "Yes, Lord," Peter said. "You know that I love you." And so Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me? I mean, truly love me with everything you have and all that you are?" And Peter replied, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Well, then take care of my sheep." They stared into the fire for a while. Then Jesus asked him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Now Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a third time, and he said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And so Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." And it's in this moment that Jesus restores Peter, right? He lifts him out of sin and shame and regret over his past, and he transforms his life as Peter steps into this way of grace that Jesus has opened up. Peter's life is forever changed, and he now becomes a conduit, I think we could say, of grace. It's not that he just received it, but he begins to share it and extend it, right? If we use this where Jesus says, "Feed my sheep," he's feeding God's grace to the people all around him, and they just begin responding and turning to Jesus. It's amazing. God's grace is amazing. His real grace, it's what people in this world are starving for. Grace that reaches out to us when we're not deserving of it. Grace that reveals God to us when we're not looking for him. He takes that first step. Grace that receives us just as we are, mess and all. Grace that restores us with his love, his massive love for you and for me. Right? This is the grace that Jesus died. He gave his life up for, to open a way for us to live in it. We've got to recapture grace. Have you experienced it in your life? Because God wants all of us to fully step into this. And because of Jesus, God's opened a way for us to live in it and also to live out of it. Right? To receive his real, true, deep grace, but also to live in such a way that extends it to others. Isn't that good news? And so what's your next step when it comes to God's grace?